The air was thick with an eerie stillness when Ethan Carter first stepped onto the driveway of his new home. Something was off, an almost invisible tension woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of unease you could put your finger on immediately, but it lurked there, waiting, watching. It didn't take long for Ethan to find the source of that tension. Standing at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand, was a woman with sharp eyes that seemed to size him up like a predator assessing its prey. Her name was Margaret Hale, the self-proclaimed queen of Pinecrest Estates. Ethan had unknowingly stepped into a chess game he hadn't signed up for, and Margaret had already decided he was her opponent. What she didn't know, and what would soon become her biggest regret, was that Ethan wasn't just some pushover she could bully. And his sister? Well, she was about to make sure Margaret learned that lesson the hard way. This is one of the wildest HOA horror stories you'll ever hear, and trust me, you're going to love how it ends. If you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It might seem small to you, but it means the world to us. And make sure you stick around, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. The first strike. It started small, a single violation notice taped to his door. The red ink glared at him like an accusation. Lawn not up to community standards. Ethan frowned, confusion bubbling in his chest. He had spent thousands of dollars installing that lawn just a week ago. It was lush, green, and perfectly trimmed. How could it possibly be in violation? He unfolded the paper with a deep breath, hoping for some kind of explanation. Instead, he found a vague paragraph about the importance of uniformity in Pinecrest Estates. His stomach clenched. He had only lived here for a few weeks, and already, someone had decided to make him their target. And he had a sickening feeling he knew exactly who it was. The next morning, as he stepped outside to inspect his offensive lawn, he heard the sharp clack of heels on pavement. He turned just in time to see her, Margaret Hale, marching toward him, clipboard in hand, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "We need to talk about your lawn." Ethan crossed his arms. "I just had it installed." "What exactly is the issue?" Margaret sighed, as if he had just asked her to explain basic arithmetic to a child. "It's too green, Mr. Carter. It doesn't match the natural aesthetic of the neighborhood." Ethan blinked. "Too green? That's a joke, right?" Her eyes narrowed. There is nothing humorous about maintaining order. Everyone else in Pinecrest Estates adheres to the guidelines. If we start making exceptions, soon we'll have chaos. Ethan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm not changing my lawn. It's within the HOA guidelines." Margaret's smile was tight, victorious. "That's where you're wrong. You didn't request approval for this particular shade of green. I suggest you remedy the situation before further fines are issued." He watched her turn and strut away, rage simmering beneath his skin. But this was only the beginning. The escalation. A few days later, another notice arrived. This time, it wasn't about his lawn. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection. Ethan groaned as he crumpled the paper in his fist. He worked late. How was he supposed to be home precisely when the trash was picked up? That evening, he saw her again, this time standing at the edge of his driveway, watching, waiting. He strode over, anger flaring in his chest. "You sent me another violation. You do realize I have a job, right?" Margaret didn't even flinch. "I do." And yet, other residents seemed capable of following simple rules. Ethan clenched his jaw. "This is ridiculous. My bins are out for a few hours at most. And yet, rules exist for a reason. You wouldn't want to be responsible for attracting pests, would you?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Pests? I live 3 doors down from someone who leaves old furniture on their porch." Margaret's expression remained cool, but her eyes flashed. "Are you suggesting I don't enforce regulations fairly, Mr. Carter? I'm suggesting you're targeting me." She tilted her head. "If you feel that way, you're welcome to take it up with the HOA board. Of course, as president, I am the board." His hands curled into fists at his sides. She had all the power, and she knew it. The mailbox incident. Then came the notice that made his blood boil. Mailbox non-compliant. Immediate correction required. Ethan didn't even bother reading the details. He stormed outside, and there she was, inspecting his mailbox with the same scrutiny one might use when examining a crime scene. "Seriously, Margaret? My mailbox? What now? She barely spared him a glance. It's not within HOA aesthetic guidelines. Too modern. Too sleek. Not the right kind of brown. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. I bought this from the list of approved mailboxes. Margaret gave a small, satisfied smile. Oh, but that list was recently updated. You must have missed the new restrictions. Ethan's fists clenched. This was beyond petty. This was a personal vendetta. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. You really have nothing better to do than harass me? Margaret smirked. It's not harassment. It's order. Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping back, forcing himself to think. She wanted a reaction. She thrived on control. But she didn't know one thing. Ethan wasn't going to break. She had started this war, but he was going to finish it. The Facebook smear campaign. Things escalated fast. Ethan had barely settled into his evening routine when he heard the sharp, rhythmic clicks of high heels approaching. The sound alone sent a pulse of irritation through him. He already knew who it was. Margaret Hale. Ethan turned, still holding the sponge, soap dripping onto the pavement. And there she was, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes burning with the fury of someone who had just caught a criminal in the act. This is unacceptable, she spat, her voice cold and clipped. You're violating HOA Regulation 5.7b, water waste and community aesthetic. Ethan blinked, not sure if she was serious. It's water. It'll dry. Margaret inhaled sharply, as if he had just cursed at her. That is not the point, Mr. Carter. Your negligence is actively disrupting the harmony of our neighborhood. That soapy runoff is seeping into the street, making our community look. She paused, glancing at the trail of suds like it was toxic waste, unkempt. Ethan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You're joking. Margaret's expression hardened. Do I look like I'm joking? Ethan felt his fingers tighten around the sponge. The audacity of this woman. He had never encountered someone so obsessed with control. Listen, I don't have time for this. I'm washing my car. It's not against the law. Margaret's lips curled into a smirk, but there was no humor in it. No, but it is against the rules. And unlike the law, my HOA rules are immediate and non-negotiable. Ethan clenched his jaw. He could feel his pulse rising, a mix of anger and disbelief swirling inside him. This is ridiculous. Margaret took a deliberate step closer, lowering her voice to a threatening whisper. You think you can ignore me? You think you're above the rules? I'll make sure you regret this. Ethan stared at her, trying to suppress the rage bubbling inside him. You're unbelievable. Margaret lifted her chin. You'll see soon enough. The police involvement. That night, Ethan shook off the encounter, convincing himself it was over. He was wrong. The next morning, he was jolted awake by a loud, relentless pounding on his front door. Hard hammering. He threw on a shirt and rushed to open it. Two uniformed officers stood on his porch. Sir, we received a report about unauthorized construction on your property. Ethan's stomach dropped. Construction? He squinted at the officers in confusion. What are you talking about? Then he saw her. Margaret stood a few feet away, arms crossed, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Margaret took a dainty step forward, her voice dripping with condescension. He's been making illegal modifications to his driveway, she announced. That's against HOA policy and city code. Ethan gaped at her. You mean me washing my car? One of the officers side-glanced at his partner. They exchanged a look, then turned to the driveway. There were no signs of construction, no tools, no changes. Just a perfectly clean car and an increasingly exasperated homeowner. The first officer turned back to Margaret. Ma'am, there's no violation here. This is a civil matter, not a police issue. Margaret's smile twitched. Well, he's still a disturbance to the neighborhood. He needs to be dealt with. The officer gave her a long, tired stare. Ma'am, you can't call 911 for neighborhood disputes. If there's no crime, we can't do anything. Margaret's face turned red. She wasn't used to being told no. She turned to the officers, her voice rising. This is unacceptable. This man is lowering the quality of our neighborhood. He's ignoring authority, being combative, and refusing to comply with our standards. How am I supposed to feel safe? Ethan scoffed. You're kidding, right? One officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Ma'am, This isn't a matter for law enforcement. Margaret's breathing grew shallow. She turned to the other officer, desperate now. If you don't do something about him, who knows what he'll do next? First, it's breaking HOA rules. Next thing you know, he'll be. Ma'am, the officer interrupted, rubbing his temple. Washing your car is not a criminal offense. Margaret's eyes darted between the officers and Ethan. Her lips trembled, fury battling humiliation. You're all useless, she spat finally. Then she stormed off, heels clicking violently against the pavement. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head as the officers turned back to him. One of them gave him a sympathetic nod. Sorry about that. Some people just love wasting our time. Ethan crossed his arms. Yeah, tell me about it. The Facebook mob. As the officers left, Ethan watched Margaret retreat into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. He figured Margaret would back off after being shut down by the cops. He was wrong. Margaret did what Margaret did best. She doubled down. But this time, she wasn't just out to cause trouble. She was out for blood. If she couldn't get him arrested, she'd turn the entire neighborhood against him. And she did it in the one place where her poison could spread like wildfire, the HOA Facebook group. The next morning, Ethan woke up to his phone vibrating nonstop. Ping, ping, ping. He groggily reached for it, only for his stomach to sink as he saw the sheer number of notifications. The HOA Facebook group was on fire, and it was all about him. Margaret had posted a long, dramatic, rage-fueled rant, painting Ethan as a dangerous influence in the neighborhood. She didn't just stop there. Oh no. She wove a carefully crafted story, one dripping with manipulation and twisted half-truths. Last night, I feared for my safety, she wrote, capitalizing words for extra drama. I was simply trying to enforce our community standards, but instead, I was met with aggression, threats, and intimidation from a certain new homeowner. I was just doing my duty to protect our peaceful neighborhood, and now I feel unsafe in my own home. Ethan nearly spit out his coffee. This woman was unhinged. She made it sound like he had stormed into her house with a baseball bat, rather than standing calmly on his own driveway while the cops told her to stop wasting their time. But Margaret wasn't done. She had crafted a full-blown smear campaign, listing out incidents that had never even happened. He leaves his trash bins out too long, making our community look like a dumpster. He washes his car in the driveway, letting water run into the street, a serious violation of HOA policy. He refuses to comply with multiple warnings and has disrespected our rules and our board members. Margaret was a master manipulator, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She framed herself as the victim, the noble guardian of their beloved community, while making Ethan look like an absolute menace. The comments poured in. This is unacceptable. We don't need people like that in our neighborhood. He sounds like a troublemaker. Why did he even move here? Do we have a way to remove homeowners who refuse to follow the rules? Ethan could feel the heat rising in his face, his fingers clenched around his coffee mug. It was insane. How could people just believe this nonsense? Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A petition. Margaret had started an actual petition in the group titled Protect Pinecrest Estates, hold reckless homeowners accountable. And the worst part? People were signing it. Ethan scrolled through the names, a sick feeling forming in his stomach. People he had barely spoken to. People who had waved at him just days ago. Some of them had even commented on his move-in post, welcoming him to the neighborhood. Now, thanks to Margaret, they were turning on him. And then came the private messages. At first, they were passive-aggressive. Hey, just a heads up, maybe try to be a little more considerate with your property. Then they got more aggressive. You're ruining this neighborhood. Then outright threatening. If you don't like the rules, leave. Ethan felt a pit form in his stomach. This wasn't just Margaret being Margaret anymore. She had successfully turned his entire neighborhood into a mob. And now, they weren't just annoyed, they were out for him. But what Margaret didn't realize was that Ethan was done playing defense. She had made a mistake, a big one, and she was about to find out what happens when you push the wrong person too far. The emergency HOA meeting. Margaret demanded an emergency meeting to discuss disciplinary action against Ethan, hoping that things would go her way. The emergency HOA meeting was set for that evening, and Ethan decided to attend, mostly for entertainment. He strolled in with a quiet confidence, grabbing a seat near the back of the packed community center. The tension in the room was thick, an almost tangible force pressing down on everyone present. Margaret, standing at the front with a stack of papers in her manicured hands, cleared her throat dramatically. "This neighborhood has rules," she declared, scanning the room with narrowed eyes. "And when one person disregards those rules, it threatens the harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." Ethan fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Are we actually doing this?" he muttered under his breath. Margaret, reveling in the attention, continued. "Ethan has been nothing but a disruptive force since he moved in. He has disrespected HOA regulations, dismissed our guidelines, and even disrespected me as the HOA president." She punctuated each accusation with a dramatic pause, as if she were presenting an airtight case in court. One of the board members, a gray-haired woman named Linda, raised a skeptical brow. "Margaret, what exactly are these violations?" Margaret scoffed. "Where do I start?" She shuffled her papers and pulled one out. "His lawn is never up to standard. His trash bins linger on the curb longer than allowed. And worst of all, he has made a mockery of our community decorum." Ethan finally spoke up. "Margaret, be honest. You just don't like me." His voice was calm, but there was an underlying steel to it that made Margaret visibly bristle. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. The spell Margaret had over them was starting to crack. Another board member, a balding man named Greg, sighed. "Margaret, we've received complaints, but not about Ethan. About you." Margaret's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Excuse me," she hissed. Linda leaned forward. "Margaret, you fine people for the most ridiculous things. Just last week, you sent a violation notice for a child's sidewalk chalk drawing. And now this emergency meeting over Ethan? This seems personal." Ethan smirked. "I think it's safe to say this isn't about community harmony." The HOA board president cleared his throat. "After careful review, we have decided that Margaret Hale will no longer hold the position of HOA president." The room erupted in murmurs, some shocked, others relieved. Margaret stumbled back, her composure crumbling. "You can't do this," she shrieked. But they just had. Margaret had lost her crown. And judging by the look on her face, that was worse than any eviction. The final reckoning. But Margaret still wasn't done. A few days later, Ethan woke up to his front yard trashed. Garbage cans knocked over. Toilet paper in his trees. Dog food scattered across his lawn. His stomach turned. He already knew who was behind this. He checked his security footage, and sure enough, there she was. Margaret, at 2 a.m., giggling like a teenager as she vandalized his yard. Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping his phone. He had given her the benefit of the doubt before, assuming she'd move on. But now it was war. He sent the footage to one person, his sister, Sheriff Rebecca Carter. That evening, a patrol car rolled up to Margaret's house. Ethan stood on his porch, watching as his sister knocked on Margaret's door. Margaret opened it, still in her robe, her face contorting when she saw the badge. "Oh, this is ridiculous," she scoffed. Rebecca flipped open a folder. "We need to talk about trespassing and vandalism." Margaret crossed her arms. "I was just teaching him a lesson." Rebecca smirked, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Right. Well, now you're facing criminal charges." Margaret paled. "Criminal charges? You can't be serious." Rebecca took a slow step forward. "You don't get to harass someone, damage their property, and call it a lesson. We have clear evidence. You will be charged." Margaret's mouth opened and closed, panic flickering behind her eyes. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Ethan finally spoke from his porch. "But you meant to do it. And now you're facing the consequences." Margaret swallowed hard, her gaze darting between Ethan and Rebecca. "Please, there has to be another way." Rebecca tilted her head. "If it were anyone else, would you be this remorseful? Or is it just because you finally got caught?" Margaret had no answer. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. The fall of the HOA queen. Margaret was finally done. Her reign of terror had crumbled beneath the weight of her own arrogance. Barely escaping jail time, she was slapped with a brutal fine, a restraining order, and a final warning. One more misstep, and she'd be locked up. For a woman obsessed with control, losing it all was pure agony. The neighborhood breathed easier, finally free from Margaret's grip. Then, one crisp morning, Ethan spotted a moving truck rumbling up to her house. It was happening. She was leaving. Ethan leaned against his porch, arms folded, watching with quiet satisfaction as movers carried out box after box. Margaret, the once untouchable HOA queen, stood stiffly by, powerless, her face tight with anger. This wasn't how she envisioned her reign ending. But Karma had other plans. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispered among themselves, some even daring to step outside. There was no sympathy, just the sweet realization that justice had been served. The woman who had tormented them was finally getting a taste of her own medicine. Ethan never wanted to miss a golden moment. He smirked and raised a hand. "Safe travels, Margaret," he called, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. Margaret turned, seething. With one last act of childish defiance, she flipped him off before slamming her car door. The engine roared, and within seconds, she was gone. The nightmare was over. The neighborhood was free. And Margaret? She had just learned the hard way. Power only lasts as long as people let you have it. If you loved watching Karma in action, hit that like button and subscribe for more. And tell me in the comments, what's the worst HOA story you've ever heard? Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.